continuing to talk about the principles that leaders should be thinking about in their organizations relevant to cybersecurity. Another principle is that leaders should test your system to see if you can trust it. And this relates to those notions that we talked about before in terms of, say, the practice phishing emails to see if employees respond to those sorts of emails. That's just one example. There's many things that employers can do in an effort to see how their employees are practicing safe cybersecurity. And this is part of the incident response planning system also, where it's sort of like a fire alarm. But you wouldn't be warning people that you're doing a fire alarm. You would be doing a cybersecurity alarm. And this is based upon this notion that so many of the breaches are responsible or are attributed to either accidental or intentional behavior by employees. So in order to make sure that we have a cybersecurity system that's ready to deal with the issues and the problems that might arise, we certainly should explore ways to test our cybersecurity response system. Now, I alluded to the fact before that accidental breaches or accidental errors occur, that employees may do something wrong accidentally and then a breach occurs. There's also the intentional ones that we mentioned, and we talked about white-collar cybercrime in an earlier module. I want to come back to that and talk about another study that one of my students did. This actually is a student at Troy University, and she did a research experience undergraduate project with myself and some others at Old Dominion University this past summer. And she, Hannah Wiggins is her name, she explored whether insiders distributed certain patterns in the breaches they committed or were responsible for in terms of the hacks and breaches that would occur. And what her research found was similar to Abby's research, that it was much higher in the month of January. Now, her database was the same, but she looked at different types of incidents. So her incidents were spread out over a longer time period. So it is, again, compelling and interesting that we do see more incidents being reported in January. And it creates some interesting implications. Now, what her research also found, and not shown here, is that women had higher frequencies of breaches than we would have expected. In fact, more often than not, you expect female offenders or female employees to have lower frequencies in terms of offending. And this particular study, for various reasons, part of it is there's a large healthcare population in this study, and that large healthcare population helped to increase the number of female breachers. But across the board, typically you find lower frequencies for females. Now, back to the principle, though, is we need to test these sorts of cybersecurity systems to see how people respond. And there are healthcare organizations that send out specific phishing types of emails that might target females more. And those types of tests are designed to see how often people would falsely click on a link or inappropriately respond to an email, and then that system test would tell us we need to address that particular situation so that the incidents don't actually happen in the future. Another principle, cybersecurity principle, is that leaders need to identify and be familiar with barriers to effective cybersecurity. And the barriers, I list several of them there, and we can spend a little bit of time talking about those barriers. Goal confusion simply refers to the point that we need to make sure that our cybersecurity goals are consistent with the organizational goals and the goals of the business unit. And the organizational goals would be based upon a certain set of values that are set by the leaders. And if those goals if it's an economically driven goal and to increase wealth or to produce certain products or sell certain services, whatever those goals are, we need to make sure that our cybersecurity goals align with the overall goals of the organization. Now, it isn't necessarily always clear, but I would suggest that as we are developing our cybersecurity incident response plan, that we need to think about what the goals of that response are and how those goals fit nicely within the goals of the overall organization. There's also what sociologists would call norm confusion. Norm confusion simply refers to confusion about what the rules are within a specific response process and a response system. And this could be dealt with through training and education, but it's a barrier in as much as people who are involved in the cybersecurity incident, including the leaders and the workers and the in some cases customers, aren't aware of what should be done during the stages of a particular cybersecurity incident. Resources are another barrier. ITS and information tech services staff will always frequently tell you they need more resources and more funds to do their jobs, but business leaders have to make that decision. How many resources can we devote to cybersecurity prevention? And the resources become an issue when technologies become more expensive, when software becomes more expensive. It also becomes a problem with when large businesses in particular that have to hire cybersecurity staff. Cybersecurity employees can be paid very well. So there's a large amount of turnover where cybersecurity staff will leave their positions to find a better paying cybersecurity job. So what that in the end does is it requires more resources so that the business is better able to maintain the level of cybersecurity staffing that they have. There's also role confusion when people aren't aware of what roles they're supposed to be fulfilling and what the expectations are in those roles during a cybersecurity response. There's ignorance about the dynamics of cybersecurity and among people who are involved, oftentimes the workers, and that ignorance or lack of understanding can create issues. There's oftentimes lack of understanding about cyber technology among leaders, and the lack of understanding about technology can create a situation where it makes it harder for the business to respond to a cyber incident. Legal constraints most certainly make it harder to respond to these incidents, and workers and employees and leaders need to know what those legal issues are. Aggressive responses can be problematic. If we respond too aggressively, then it gets difficult to respond. And in fact, too aggressive a response in some situations may make problems worse. Note that businesses aren't allowed to attack back. If they are attacked by a hacker, that the law prohibits them from attacking back and dismantling and harming the computer that's attacking them. That sort of aggressive response would, if they did do that, would be certainly problematic. And then lack of training is, again, another issue. And this is part of the reason why the training industry is growing so significantly and expected to continue to grow in the upcoming years. Another principle for cybersecurity leaders is, sure, there's barriers, but leaders need to know how to overcome those barriers. They need to figure out what they can do to address goal confusion and norm confusion and the lack of understanding about technology and the other barriers that surface. And when they address those barriers and they take those barriers and they turn them from being limitations to being opportunities, then leaders become more effective in responding to cybersecurity issues that may arise in their businesses. Now, part of this includes knowing what to do and having the knowledge that's needed to eliminate confusion and to reduce confusion. Part of it also stems from having a certain level of attention to detail and knowing specific elements that would help in the response to these incidents when they arise. It also includes balancing the risk and reward. Particularly, we've noted this before with the resources, finding that right level of staffing and being able and willing to provide the resources that's needed. Asking the right questions is certainly imperative, and leaders and those of you who are going to be leaders in businesses or any organization will want to know how to ask questions. Nobody expects you to know everything, but people do expect you to ask questions, to listen, to learn, to launch, and then to do something based upon what you've learned. And then collaboration is another element or activity that business leaders can engage in their responses to the barriers they face. This brings us to our last principle that we're going to talk about. And that last principle is leaders need to make sure that every employee is responsible for protecting computer systems and networks. This one is worth repeating. Leaders need to make sure that every employee is responsible for protecting computer systems and networks. In this sense, if we were in a room with a group of, say, 100 people in a business, and we asked who here is responsible for cybersecurity, and just the cybersecurity staff raised their hands, or the IT staff, we would say, you are wrong. Everyone in a business who's connected to cyber environment or cyberspace is responsible for protecting computer networks and computer systems. This starts with hiring. And in addition to the hiring and figuring out the best ways to hire people and the ways that we can hire in a way that identifies risk for cyber offending or cyber errors, it also includes policies and having the right policies to address potential cyber incidents. In addition to policies, ongoing education and training is relevant. Rewards and sanctions also become relevant. Culture will certainly cut across the need to ensure that all of our employees see that they're responsible for protecting computer systems and networks. And in addition to the hiring process and the policies and the training and the rewards and sanctions and culture, having adaptive policies. Adaptive policies are flexible and address and respond to the changes in technology and the changes in regulations. These sorts of things will help to make sure that employees are responsible for protecting computer systems and networks. In the next mini module, we're going to unpack each of these and talk a little bit more about the way that leaders make sure that employees are responsible in each of these specific areas.